young avant-garde architects that had learned a lot from Le Corbusier, but now wanted to take it into another direction that was much more about creating a new society. They saw in these bomb sites the possibility of creating a whole new, much more free, much more equal society. So you could see that all over London, in bomb sites, these modernist housing projects grew up. And while now it is very difficult for us to look at them as images of new ideas of freedom and of urban possibility, this was exactly how they were made. This is, for example, the Barbican Centre, just outside the city of London. And this one is still a success, but that is mainly because it is basically the only housing project or the only offering of housing within probably the most expensive piece of real estate in the world, which is the financial heart of London, the City of London. So here you can see these enormous wavy monumental buildings with all their possibilities of pedestrian platforms folding over each other. This new scale of living that literally hovers above the depressing streets and alleys of old London, but also in the city of Sheffield, the Park Hill estate, an enormous complex of Bijlmer-like slabs, where it is nearly impossible to realize once you're walking there if you are on the ground floor, the third floor, the fifth floor, or underground or wherever, because the thing is so complex and so layered and so interwoven that it completely creates its own geography, and it really creates a complete alternative world for the city that it was built next to. A very impressive estate. So the British, they were really in that, it's also very big. And very small at the same time. Here it is again. The Golden Lane estate, another one right in the center of London. Also creating all these new possibilities, one of which, of course, is also a house with a bathroom. You have to remember that for many people who lived here, it was the first time they had that. Again, with all these layers, all these possibilities, all this pedestrian space, no more cars, no more. So this was where it was built. And then an interesting thing happened. In the late 60s, this idea completely changed already when one of these housing estates, there was a gas explosion on the 5th floor and the whole side of the building fell down, and there were a rather large number of people killed. The Ronan Point incident was more or less the turning point in the belief that these areas could actually work. You can see it. And it became, like for Britain, what the demolition in the early 70s would be of the collapse of the dream of Le Corbusier. It's very strange how it works in this way, how the idea that a certain city form can be good, can survive for many, many years, and then one incident can turn it around, and then people say, we cannot let people live in these areas. And it's always the incidents that everybody focuses on, because there is so little knowledge of these much slower movements that are going on at the same time. Because what really happened in these estates was that in the first years after they had been built, the pioneers move in, the people who really believe in this kind of stuff, who want a new way of life. Or the people who had never had, as I said, a house with a bathroom anymore. After 5 or 10 years, these people have children. They get a little bit more money. There are also other, the housing industry comes up to speed. Suburban houses are also built, and it makes it possible for the people who lived a perfectly happy life for 5 or 10 years in these housing estates to take the next step and move into a suburban house. And then nobody wants to live in this stuff anymore. Immigration starts happening. People who live there are not the people who make a conscious choice of going to live there, but are the people who get forced to live there, which kind of explains in a real estate way the background to the feeling that, for example, also this black culture had, that once they were living in an estate like Broadwater Farm, that they were actually being locked up in a citadel instead of living in a dream of freedom created by Le Corbusier. So, these are just some images. The order of my slides must be very confusing to you. I apologize for that. These are some slides from this early generation of British architects, the ones that, for example, also were involved in designing directly or indirectly places like Broadwater Farm. This is, for example, an image of the Smithsons, who proposed the design for Golden Lane for one of these bomb sites in London. And the interesting thing what they did was that they took images. They were the first photoshoppers, but then with scissors and glue. This is, for example, a very famous British film star from the new Angry Young Men, new British cinema of the early 50s. And they cut him out and they put him in the front of this new building that they put in the middle of a bomb site. So it's interesting, this use of pop culture images, very roughly sketched designs, and then on top of an image of a destroyed piece of the city. And in these, you can see that inside these flats, this is how they imagined it. This kind of, that the city does not just stop at the ground floor and then you have houses in it, but the city kind of goes through and through the building. The city is everywhere. Possibilities and freedom and possibilities of exchange are everywhere. So it's a kind of liberation of the British class system. It's a liberation of this kind of pre-war, hierarchical, nearly military, imperialist atmosphere that existed in Britain. Here, for example, also images of from American films. People really did not look like that in the early 50s in Britain, being projected into these, the galleries. So the galleries really were streets where hip people would live, and there would be a real modern urban life being created by these gallery flats. And these gallery flats could even become huge megastructures that would stretch all over the city. The same beliefs were being held also in France by their kind of brothers, ideological brothers. I will talk about this in two lectures from now. Also here you can see this obsession with the elevated walkway everywhere in these plans. And that is something that, of course, it played a role in the original Le Corbusier plans, but it became an absolute obsession for this generation of architects in the 50s and 60s especially, to create a whole new city, not just to create a new type of buildings and putting them on the ground, but to knit together these buildings with elevated concrete walkways that would elevate these new buildings as a new system above the existing city, above the existing landscape, because these new elevated walkways, these floating platforms, they would create a whole new platform, a whole new space, a whole new cosmos maybe of where new free interactions would be able to take place. This is a scheme of it. So the existing ground floor was irrelevant. You could use it for parks or for parking cars. But the real interaction, the real urban space would be in the buildings itself and on the elevated walkways. That is more or less the spatial architectural ideology of the 60s, of which Broadwater Farm was a very pure and very ideological example. Of course, this was the dream. Probably these kids were forced together by the photographer, because the reality, if you zoom out, would be more like this, and in the end, like this. The elevated walkways were not just the obsession of the planners of the 60s, they also were the kind of realization of many of the real utopian plans of the 60s. This idea of lifting up a whole new system above the world. Archie Graham with their floating and their walking cities. This idea of beyond the city lies another city. The beyond the world is another world. Architecture is not just the building of buildings in the existing world. Architecture is the beginning of creating a complete alternative for the world. And of course, forced with the political and also lifestyle breakthroughs of the 60s, Archie Graham is a kind of perfect example of that. And now everybody, of course, associates Archie Graham with pure freedom, with projects and visions that that they were never aimed at being realized at all. Pure utopian theoretical architecture. But in fact, Archie Graham was also at that time working for exactly the developer and the building company and the planners of Broadwater Farm. Archie Graham did not design Broadwater Farm, but at the very same time that Broadwater Farm was being designed, Archie Graham was working with exactly the same company, the same building company, the same concrete factory that made the prefab elements that Broadwater Farm was made of. They also employed Archie Graham to develop new ideas and buildings for them. So do not think that Archie Graham was a pure theoretical office that had nothing to do with the reality and just wanted to escape from it. They were also actually involved in making these large-scale social housing estates that all had this obsession with a verticalized urban life. And so they were very much part of this movement in which the most wild hippie fantasies of an alternative lifestyle, plus the most bureaucratic and massive and quantitative delivery of houses on an industrial scale, these two things came together in these massive housing projects in the 60s in England. So even if you, here again is a study by Archie Graham for a housing project in Fulham in London. So here you can see that it's a little bit wilder and a little bit more expressive than the stuff that was built in Broadwater Farm, but you see all the same elements there. The pedestrian, the slabs that are being knitted together by the elevated walkways, lifted above the city with its cars. So you see all the elements here. So all the how do you say, accusations in the 80s of the British housing estates in the 60s, that they were based on cynical, pure quantitative design with no regard for human behavior, is absolutely wrong. That does not, by the way, make the projects better, but we have to also understand and try to understand these projects as being absolutely, how do you say, based on the absolute best intentions and the most romantic intentions as an architect could have. Now, just as the elevated walkway was the main obsession of planners and modernist architects and planners in the 1960s, it also became the main obsession of the critics of the planners and architects of the 60s in the 80s. So Alice Coleman, a geographer in London, who wrote this book called Utopia on Trial, which is a kind of statistical and geographical